The settlement had no proper name anymore. Names belonged to things that expected to survive. Augusto Reyes had been sleeping in the hollow of a burst supply drum when the sky changed. Not changed the way a storm changes it. Not the slow bruising purple that rolls in from the eastern ridgeline before the rains. This was different. This was a color that had no business being in any sky. A deep iridescent bronze that pulsed once, twice, like a second heartbeat overlaid on the world, and then held. Held until every shadow in the settlement pointed somewhere new. Until the dogs stopped barking and just sat down in the dirt and stared upward with their ears flat, the way dogs do when they have decided that whatever is happening is entirely beyond their jurisdiction. Augusto pulled himself out of the drum with the slow deliberateness of a man who has learned not to waste effort on surprise. He was 46 years old, and he looked 60. He had a bad knee, a left hand that didn't close all the way anymore, and a thing inside his chest that the colony's last medic had called scarring, and that Augusto privately thought of as the place where his brother used to live. He stood in the bronze light and looked up and saw the ship. It was not a warship. He'd seen those once from a distance, back when the first contact was still called first contact, and not simply the day everything ended. Warships were long and angular and moved like thrown blades. This was something else, rounded, almost organic, the color of old copper, trailing thin tendrils of vapor as it descended in a wide, unhurried arc over the valley. It was the size of a cathedral. It made no sound that his ears could register, but he felt it in his back teeth, a sustained vibration like a cello note played below the range of hearing. People were coming out of shelters now, 43 people in this settlement, which was what remained of the Bambamarca district, after 3 years of Kethvar occupation, and the subsequent abandonment, when the Kethvar moved on toward the coast, and left behind a landscape so thoroughly stripped that it was easier to just go than to try to rebuild. 43 people had stayed or drifted back anyway, because some people are made of a specific gravity and cannot move far from the ground where they were born. Old Marisol was clutching her rosary. Volante was standing on top of a water tank with his hand shading his eyes like he was watching a parade. The settlement's de facto leader, a former civil engineer named Teodora Valise, who had survived the occupation by being too stubborn to die, stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the expression she wore when she was afraid, and had decided not to let it show. The ship landed in the field behind the old school. Not landed, settled, the way a very large, very tired bird settles. The vapor dissipated. The bronze light faded back to ordinary morning gray. And then, nothing happened for a while, and people who had been holding their breath let it out. And Augusto walked to the edge of the field and looked at the ship and thought about what he knew. What he knew was this. The Kethvar were not the only ones out there. The Kethvar were the ones who had come to take, who had stripped the planet of 7 specific mineral compounds that apparently existed on Earth in concentrations found nowhere else in their mapped space. They had been efficient and impersonal about it the way a mining operation is efficient and impersonal. They had not been cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. They had simply not considered, even for a moment, whether what they were extracting the minerals from might have opinions about it. But there were others. There had been transmissions in the early years, fragments of information passed between survivor communities on old radio equipment. Transmissions talking about ships that had come not to take, but to observe. Ships that had held position over human settlements for hours, and then left without incident. One transmission, from a community in what used to be northern Finland, describing a contact in which 3 entities had come out of a ship and healed a man who had been dying of radiation sickness from a Kethvar extraction site. Healed him with their hands. With hands that, the transmission said, appeared black, not dark-skinned, not shadowed, but truly, entirely black, like objects that had been removed from the category of color altogether. Augusto had been carrying that transmission in his memory for 2 years. He had thought about it the way a man with a specific and private wound thinks about a rumored doctor in a far city, carefully, from a distance. Not quite allowing himself hope, because hope at this point in his life felt like a thing that required more structural support than he could provide. The ship's side opened. 3 figures came out. They were small. That was the first thing. He had expected something large. The Kethvar had been large, 8 feet of pale segmented exoskeleton, moving with the clacking precision of things that had evolved in low gravity and never fully adapted to Earth's pull. These were small, barely 5 feet, wrapped entirely in material that seemed to absorb light, the way water absorbs a stone. He couldn't tell if they had faces. He couldn't tell much of anything about them, except that they moved with a quality he couldn't name for a moment, and then could. They moved with patience. Not slowness. Patience. The distinction matters. Slow implies that something is working against resistance. These things moved as if time were simply not a factor they were negotiating with. They walked into the settlement, and they stopped. Theodora walked out to meet them. Augusto watched her do it, and felt the particular pride he always felt watching Theodora Valise walk toward things she was afraid of. She was carrying nothing, no weapon, no tool, hands open at her sides. Behind her, some of the 43 had come out. The children had been pushed to the back by adult hands. Old Marisol's rosary beads made their small plastic clicking sound in the quiet. One of the 3 figures raised one hand. The hand was black. Not the material of the wrapping. The hand itself, where it extended beyond the material at the wrist. Black the way the transmission had described. Black like an area of space where stars weren't. Theodora stopped. The figure held its hand up for a moment and then lowered it, slowly, and pressed it against the earth. Something happened that Augusto could not fully process in real time and would spend weeks afterward trying to accurately reconstruct. The ground around the figure's hand, a rough circle maybe 2 meters across, changed. Not visually, or not only visually. The dead brown soil in that circle became something else, darker, richer, and from it, within the span of maybe 30 seconds, small green shoots emerged and grew. Not fast the way time-lapse photography makes things look fast. Fast the way a thing growing inside time looks when time has been persuaded to cooperate. The shoots were not any plant Augusto recognized. They were short, dense-leaved, silvery green, and they smelled. He was close enough to smell them, like clean water, and something else. Something with no analog in his experience. Something that the inside of his nose tried to categorize as salt and mineral, and decided it couldn't. The figure raised its hand from the earth. The black receded partway up the arm, and then held there. The 3 figures looked at Theodora. She looked back at them for a long time. Then she said, in Spanish, with the flat practicality of a civil engineer assessing load-bearing capacity, "Can you do that to a person?" Augusto did not see what happened next, because he had already decided what he was going to do, and he was going to have to do it before he thought about it long enough to stop himself. He needed to get close to them without Theodora noticing. This was not difficult. Theodora was occupied. More importantly, Augusto had spent 3 years in this settlement, and the years before that in the occupation, and he had developed the specific skill of not being noticed that belongs to men who have learned that visibility is a form of spending. You spend it, and you get something, and you'd better make sure what you get is worth what you spend. He circled around through the space behind the old school, moving along the outside of the field where the ship sat. Up close it was extraordinary. Not threatening, not aggressive, but extraordinary in the way that natural objects of immense scale are extraordinary. Cliff face, like a dead whale on a beach. Something that made the human scale feel like a temporary arrangement of measurements, appropriate for most purposes, but not load-bearing at the cosmological level. He found a position behind a collapsed wall about 30 meters from where the 3 figures stood with Theodora and a small, nervous cluster of the settlement's people. Here he could observe. What he observed over the next 2 hours was this. The figures healed. They did it, one at a time, with the black hands. And it was nothing like what the stories about healers are usually like. There was no laying on of hands and sudden brilliant light. There was no dramatic reversal. It was slow. It looked, frankly, like work. First one approached old Marisol, who had a thing in her lungs from the extraction site fallout. Everyone in the valley had a version of that thing, some worse than others, and placed one black hand against her sternum, over her clothes, and held it there. And the figure went very still, frozen. Still the way a surgeon is still when a hand is inside a body cavity. Present, committed, focused to a degree that excluded everything else. Isolde stood like a woman receiving something she had decided to accept and not question. After perhaps 20 minutes, the figure withdrew its hand. The black on the hand had climbed higher, past the wrist now, halfway up the forearm. Figure stood very still for another minute. And then one of the other two approached it and placed its own hand on the first one's shoulder and held it there. And the black slowly retreated. Not entirely, but enough. Augusto watched the hand carefully. He was a man who paid attention to costs. They worked through the afternoon. Not everyone. They seemed to choose, or to sense, who needed it most. They did 7 people, children first. 2 adults with the worst of the fallout damage. Then Teodora herself, who accepted it with the same expression she brought to every difficult thing, which was the expression of someone who has decided that control is not always the relevant variable. By late afternoon, the shadows were long, and the figures were moving more slowly. The black on all 3 of them had climbed. One of them wore it now past the elbow. Stos thought of the transmission again. He thought of what the healing cost them. He thought about how a person, how a thing, how a being of any kind that spent itself like that would feel about being asked to do more. He thought about the things inside his chest. The place where his brother used to live. His brother Matteo had died on the 2nd day of the occupation. Not from the Kethvar directly. From a building that the Kethvar's equipment had destabilized. A 4-story structure that had stood since 1978 and had survived every earthquake and every rain season and had not survived the subsonic vibrations of extraction equipment. Teo had been inside looking for medicine for their mother. Augusto had been outside and had heard the building come down and had not gone in. Not from cowardice. He had calculated, in the 2 seconds available for calculation, that going in would produce 1 more body in the rubble. This was probably the correct calculation. Augusto had had 3 years to examine it from every angle, and he was still, on most days, approximately 60% convinced it was the correct calculation. The other fortitude he danced in his chest like a piece of metal that had not fully come out. He needed the figures to take it out. He did not even now fully believe that was possible. What he believed was that they could do something to the human body that went beyond the medicine he understood, and that the wound he carried was in some sense a physical thing. The medical evidence for this being that he sometimes woke at 3 in the morning, certain that his sternum had cracked, certain that there was an opening there through which cold air was entering, and he would press his palm against his chest and feel nothing, feel the ordinary surface of his own body, and lie in the dark until morning, with his hand pressed there anyway. He stood up from behind the wall and walked toward them. The 3 figures saw him coming and did not react. This was either good or very bad, and he had decided not to adjudicate which. Teodora saw him too. He watched her face process several things rapidly. That he had been there the whole time, that she hadn't noticed, that he was now doing something she had not authorized, and that authorization was something that Augusto Reyes had always treated as a suggestion, rather than a constraint. Jaw tightened. She didn't stop him. He stopped about 2 meters from the nearest figure and stood there. Up close, they were even more impossible to read. The material they wore was not a suit in the way a spacesuit is a suit. It seemed to grow from them, or to be a transitional zone between their interior and the outside world, rather than a covering. He could see, or thought he could see, a face inside the darkness where the hood was. Something with eyes, large ones, set wide, amber-colored, currently focused on him with an attention that he felt physically, the way you feel a strong light source when your eyes are closed. He opened his mouth and said the only thing he could think of, which was, "I need you to fix something that isn't broken." Nobody translated. He hadn't expected translation. One of the figures turned its head, the slow, patient turn, and the amber eyes focused, and he felt that attention shift fully onto him, and it was like being the only object in a very large room. Pressed his fist against his chest, against the place. "My brother died," he said, 3 years ago. "He died and I survived, and I have been carrying it since then, and I would like to put it down." He felt saying it, how absurd it was, how completely untranslatable. He was asking an alien entity to perform surgery on a metaphor. He was standing in a dead field, in a ruined settlement, asking something that healed radiation sickness and fallout damage to reach inside him and remove guilt. Survivor's guilt. The specific human experience of being alive when someone you loved is not, and of being unable to stop calculating whether you could have changed that, and of knowing that the calculation doesn't matter, and of not being able to stop running it anyway. He kept his fist pressed against his chest and looked at the amber eyes and did not look away. One of the other two figures made a sound. Not a word, or not a word in any language he had structure for. A pattern of clicks and low tonal shifts that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then stopped. The figure facing him made a responding sound, shorter. Then a third sound from the first longer with something in the middle of it that sounded. And he knew this was almost certainly projection. Tired. About him. He waited. The nearest figure took one step forward, then another. It raised the black hand, the one where the black had climbed highest, nearly to the shoulder, and held it in front of him, palm out, not reaching for him, showing him. He looked at the hand, at what the healing had cost, written on this thing's body in black. He thought about how to say what he needed to say without language. He thought about it for about 2 seconds, and then he stopped thinking and did the thing that felt true. He reached out and took the hand in both of his and held it. Not in a handshake. The way you hold something you are grateful for. The way you hold something that has carried a weight and you want it to know. You understand the weight was real. The hand was cool, not cold. Cool the way stone is cool in shadow. And then it changed. Not in temperature, but in quality. Something in it shifted against his palms like a tide turning, like a pressure gradient equalizing. And he felt, in the place in his chest where the metal had been, something move. It didn't vanish. He wants to be precise about this, in the telling of it later. It did not vanish the way a wound closes. It moved. It moved from the place where it had been lodged against his sternum. That cramped, pressured spot that had lived there for 3 years. And it moved somewhere else. It moved to a larger place. A place with more room. He did not stop carrying it. What changed was where it was being carried. And where it was being carried, it no longer occluded anything. It no longer pressed against breathing. It was still there. Matteo was still dead. Augusto had still stood outside the building. The calculation was still what it was. The calculation was in a room now, instead of a hallway, and there was space around it, and he could walk past it without turning sideways. And he let go of the hand. He was crying, which surprised him, because he had not cried since the second day of the occupation, and had believed himself to be structurally incapable of it at this point. Figure lowered its hand. The black had moved, not retreated, moved. Shh. It was different from how it had been on the other 7 people. On them the black had climbed, and then been pulled back by the contact between the 2 figures. On Augusto's figure, the black had not climbed. It had redistributed, spreading itself more evenly from fingertip to shoulder, instead of concentrating near the hand. The way a burden shifts when it is carried differently. The 3 figures were looking at each other. Teodora was standing beside Augusto now. She had come up quietly and stood there and she did not say anything, which was how Augusto knew she had seen what happened and understood that there was nothing appropriate to say. The clicking tonal language moved between the figures for a long moment. Then one of them, not the one who had taken his hand, a different one, turned and walked back toward the ship. It disappeared inside. The other 2 waited. The first one came back holding something. An object roughly the size and shape of a book, flat, dark, that it carried with both hands, and set down on the ground in front of Augusto with a deliberateness that was clearly ceremony, clearly intentional. Something being placed, not dropped. Augusto looked at it. Teodora crouched down beside it and looked at it with the focused attention she gave to structural problems, reading it, trying to parse it. "Don't touch it yet," Augusto said. She looked at him. "Let them tell us what it is first," he said. The figure that had set it down pressed one hand against it briefly. A black hand, clear contact, and then lifted the hand away. Where the hand had been, the surface of the object had changed. Was changing. Something was forming there, rising from the surface in faint relief. And as it formed, Augusto felt his understanding reshape itself around what he was looking at. The way your eyes adjust to darken shapes you couldn't see a moment ago become present. It was a map. Not of the planet, or not only of the planet. It was. He would spend a long time trying to describe this, and the best he would manage was. It was a diagram of conditions, geography, conditions, the things required for a given outcome. There were marks on it that he thought, later, with the help of the settlement's small community of people who had been trying to maintain scientific literacy in difficult circumstances, indicated soil composition, atmospheric particulate levels, water table depth, subsurface mineral profiles. There were marks that he could not interpret and would not be able to for months, until a former agricultural researcher who had walked 50 kilometers from another settlement looked at it and went very quiet and said, "This is a protocol. This is instructions for remediation, for restoring the extraction site." But what Augusto understood standing there in the fading afternoon light, with his eyes still wet and the thing in his chest distributed differently than it had ever been distributed before, was something simpler and more important. They were leaving something behind. These things. These small patient aliens with their costly black hands, who had come from somewhere in the space between stars to a broken valley in the Peruvian highlands, were not just healing the people. They were leaving instructions for healing the land. They were telling humans how to fix their own world. Because, he realized, and the realization arrived with a physical weight, like stepping off a high step and landing harder than expected. They had needed to know if humans would ask. Not ask for help in the way you extend a hand to someone drowning. Ask in the other way. Ask for the thing that is not the obvious thing. Ask for what is underneath the obvious thing, the thing that can't be easily named, the thing that requires you to stand in front of an alien entity and press your fist against your chest and say, "There is something here that I need to put down differently, not remove, differently, and I know that makes almost no sense, and I am going to say it anyway." The Kethvar had come to Earth because Earth had what they needed. These things had come to Earth because Earth had something they could not verify without looking. Whether the people who lived here were the kind of people who could receive a gift without being made smaller by receiving it. Whether they were the kind of people who knew the difference between being fixed and being changed. Whether they understood that carrying a weight and carrying it well were different things, and that no one could take the weight, only help you find a better way to hold it. Augusto had stood in front of them with his fist on his chest and asked for exactly that. He hadn't known in the asking that he was being tested. He thought, later, that this was probably the point. The figures stayed for 3 more days. They healed everyone who came to them. And more came from other settlements. Word traveling the way, word always travels through broken places, which is faster than it has any right to. They healed fallout damage and infection and 2 cases of things that had no name in any medicine the settlement had access to. Things that the occupation had left behind in bodies the way a flood leaves debris. They worked until the black on each of them had climbed as high as it would go, and then the other 2 would work on the third, paying each other back into functioning. They gave nobody anything they did not ask for. This turned out to be the key thing. This turned out to be what Augusto would try to explain, in the years after, to the people who asked him what had happened, what they were like, what it meant. They did not give anyone anything they did not ask for. They did not decide what people needed. They did not look at a man sitting in the dark with a piece of metal in his chest and reach in without permission. They stood there, patient as stone, costly as anything he had ever seen, and they waited for the asking. On the morning of the 4th day, Teodora met them in the field with a folded piece of paper. Her own technical drawings done with the stub of a pencil, showing what she understood of the map they'd left, and the 3 questions she still had about it. She handed it to the nearest figure with the flat-handed Andean gesture of offering that people in this part of the world used when giving something important. 2 hands, slight bow, a brief meeting of eyes. Figure took the paper, held it with both hands, made its sounds. Then it pressed one hand flat against the paper, very gently, and the paper changed. New marks appeared alongside Teodora's drawings, finer, more precise, filling in the gaps in what she'd asked about. She looked at them for a long time. Then she folded the paper back up and put it in her jacket pocket and said to no one in particular, "Okay, I think I understand the water table part now." The figures went back to their ship. The ship lifted, made its wide arc, climbed into the sky, and became the sky, and then became nothing the human eye could track. Augusto stood in the field and watched it go. Old Marisol stood beside him. She was breathing better than she'd breathed in 2 years. She'd commented on this, with her characteristic restraint, which was to say she had gone to the edge of the settlement and breathed in very deeply, and then returned without mentioning it to anyone. But the color in her face was different. "They'll come back," she said. "I don't know," Augusto said. "But you think so?" He thought about the map. Shh. He thought about the protocol. He thought about the particular quality of an investment versus a charity. How one expects return and the other doesn't. He thought about how you would test whether something was worth coming back to. Shh. "I think they'll come back when we've done something with what they left us," he said. "I think they'll come back when there's something to come back to." Marisol made the sound she made when she considered something, and decided it was probably true. It was a short sound. It took no more air than necessary. She had always been economical with what she had. "Then we'd better get started," she said, and went inside. Augusto stood in the field for a while longer. The ground in the circle where the first figure had pressed its hand, 3 days ago now, 4 days, was still showing those small silvery green plants. They had grown slowly in the way of things that were growing in the right direction, and not in a hurry. Around them, in a radius that had been expanding by a few centimeters each day, the dead brown soil was changing, darkening, taking on the quality that Augusto associated with soil that intended to be soil again. He crouched down and pressed his palm against the earth. Not to feel anything particular, not to test it. Just because it was the thing to do. Because that was how you greeted a thing that was trying to come back. He stayed there for a while, hand flat on the ground, feeling the cold and the faint give of it, and from somewhere in the eastern sky a bird, a real bird, one of the scraggly handful that had been inching back into the valley all year, made 3 short sounds and then was quiet. He thought, Mateo would have known what kind of bird that was. Mateo had known all the birds, had known them by sound, had known their routes and their seasons, had kept a small hand-drawn catalog in a notebook that was somewhere in the rubble of the building that had come down on him. A notebook that Augusto had thought about every day for 3 years, but had never gone back to find. Because it was under a building and extracting, it felt like the wrong kind of ending. He thought, maybe it isn't buried anymore. Maybe the excavation that needs to happen is something a civil engineer with proper instructions could organize. Maybe a notebook like that belongs in the world, not under it. He stood up. His bad knee complained. His left hand didn't close all the way. The bird made its 3 sounds again from the east, and this time there was an answer from somewhere to the south, a different sound, a different bird, call and a response across a valley that was trying to remember what it used to be. Augusto walked back toward the settlement. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. The difference was that now the work had a shape, and a shape is what you need to begin. That. And the willingness to ask for what you actually need, instead of what you think you're allowed to want. He had spent 3 years not knowing he was carrying the second thing like a stone in his other pocket. He didn't fault himself for it. 3 years wasn't so long. Some people carried stones in both pockets their whole lives and never once thought to set one down and pick up something better. He was 46 years old, and he looked 60, and his knee was bad, and his hand didn't close all the way, and he was, by any reasonable measure, starting very late. He started anyway.